special event to launch the special edition of Development in Practice, which INTRAC guest edited last year. Many of you will know that INTRAC used to hold the editorship of Development in Practice. We held it from 2010 to 2020. So when we had the opportunity to, and then it passed over to the Development Studies Association of Australia. But it's been great to have the opportunity to edit this special issue. And I just wanted to start by really thanking Emily Finlay, who's the managing editor, and Patrick Kilby, who's the editor-in-chief, because their support in pulling this editorial, well, the edition together has been invaluable, and we wouldn't have been able to produce it without them. I also wanted to mention my co-editors. Hopefully many of them are on the call today. We decided that I would host and chair this event. I'm not quite sure. I think maybe I drew the short straw for that, but hopefully I'll do it okay. But we all worked together over quite a long period. So Suzanne Hammond, who used to sit on INTRAC's board, and I first came up with the idea, and then we were lucky enough to persuade Charles Van Dyke, Logan Cochrane and Naila Faruqi to join us as the editorial team. And it was just great working together to steer this special issue. And I don't think any of us quite realised it would take us nearly 3 years from when we first thought about it to actually launching it. But we've definitely, it's been a great working progress. Before I go on to talk about the authors and the practice they'll be sharing with you today, I just wanted to give a bit more background to the special issue and why we spent time curating it. As I'm sure you're all aware, in the international development community and the civil society community, we talk a lot about shifting the power, and there are a lot of good articulations of what a power-shifted future might look like. As INTRAC, we're really committed. We're committed to support the movement to shift the power. In our strategic framework, we have a goal of supporting local and global actors to reimagine their role and relationships. But we're particularly interested in how. How does this happen? So we think there's great thinking about what it can look like, really good movement to try and encourage that to happen. But we're interested in that how, which is often complicated, messy, non-linear. It might take 2 steps forward and then take 1 sideways or backwards. And it's often easier to talk about the successes rather than the learning and the difficulty. So in putting together this special issue, we really wanted to call practitioners to share how they'd made shifting the power meaningful in their context, and to use the process of co-authorship to reflect and learn on their practice. And so you're going to hear from seven of the co-authors today, but they all wrote their articles with someone else, and they're here representing the group of people that they wrote the article with. And we felt that sort of co-authorship was a really important process of shifting the power as you learn and reflect from practice. Over the last 2 years since we first issued the call, the context for international development has shifted significantly. There's been the cuts to ODA, ever deepening questions of legitimacy, what's the role and the future of aid itself. And we're still reflecting on whether these cuts will encourage or undermine action to shift the power. But what we are clear about is that as traditional funding streams contract, the need to develop resilient, accountable and locally sustained ecosystems has become even more important and urgent. So the authors you will hear from shortly offer hard-won insights, not only about what must change, but also how change can actually unfold through dialogue, disruption and collective learning. And through the issue, through our engagement with the authors and through each other, we found that there was a sort of commitment to the idea of abundance and growth. So sometimes the idea of shifting the power can sound quite binary, but actually what came through the articles is a need to grow together, to create more power, if you like, and an optimism and an affirmation and a faith in our collective power and ethical compass, something that we surely need today to propel us forward at a time when the world seems ever more challenging. The special issue itself contains 12 contributions, which each explore different dimensions of shifting the power, and we've got 7 of those represented today. And I just wanted to quickly mention a couple of the other ideas that are missing from our panel, and also to encourage you to read the articles that we'll talk about today and any of the other ones as well. One of them, which I found really interesting, was a challenge from Monroe and Raman on the very foundations of the Shift the Power movement. They argued that the movement itself overestimates the importance of the development industry for everyday life, and stated that in fact power has already shifted to the global south, and the focus should be on the institutions of the global south that currently repeat colonial practice rather than responding to national priorities. And that by focusing all the attention on the development industry rather than South-South cooperation or national institutions, it risks romanticizing aid rather than creating enabling conditions for sustainable development. And I think it's really worth a read to consider where do power shifts need to happen, which is one of the questions we asked in the editorial. Secondly, there was a challenge from Ahmed and the co-authors of that article about who can be a researcher and where they can do research. A lot of the Shift the Power dialogue emphasises proximate and contextual knowledge, and in this article, a different perspective is suggested, arguing that by limiting Global South researchers to research on their country of origin, it not only limits their ability to become experts, but also raises challenges of security and the psychological toll for researchers. And rather, there should be a focus on plurality of possibilities and positionalities. And I found that really interesting just because there is such an important emphasis on contextual knowledge that sometimes we set it out as a dichotomy and forget about knowledge across contexts. Many of the other articles are located more closely within the sector-wide discussions on Shift the Power and collectively identify many of the different ingredients we need to support power shifts. Some of these have been previously identified, but we found the articles themselves provided a richness to those ideas, showing why mindset matters and what it looks like in practice, how relationships and relational practice can model and challenge traditional hierarchies, the importance of grappling with complexity, and being patient and honest. Power relations exist, as does expertise, and it's important to work with this and not deny its existence. But the shift needs to be from invitation, from not to not impose, but to invite that expertise. Finally, the article showed us that shifting power is a journey, it's not a destination. Power dynamics have to be continually contested. It's not enough to understand and identify power. There's a need to continue to invest in the dialogue and continually commit to the practice, to sit in the space, even when the process of change is complicated and uncomfortable. And the practice shifts are not about absolutes or big ideas, but about meaningful engagement, listening and learning together, and continuing to dream for something different. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, each of whom we've given them 6 minutes, which I'm going to try and hold them to share some of their reflections on their experiences of shifting the power and also share some ideas for others to think about in relation to your practice. So we're going to spend 6 minutes each, and I'm going to go through one by one. Please do put questions in the chat as you listen to the panelists. There'll be time at the end for me to ask them questions based on what's in the chat. And as Andy said at the beginning, we will be recording everything, we'll send it out and we'll do a summary. The last thing I wanted to say before going to Ashika, who will be our first contributor, is that for INTRAC, as I said at the beginning, we're really interested in the practice and the how, and we put quite a lot of attention on that, but we also put quite a lot of attention on generating knowledge for the sector to really support others in taking their practice forward. And we put on events like this for free, which we hope you enjoy, but we would also really invite you to support our Knowledge for All campaign, which is to enable us to continue to do work like this and to sort of generate ideas from practice and share it back with you for free. So you can find out more about that on the website, or Andy has just posted the link. So the first person who's going to share their experience is Ashika. She's the CEO of Chrysalis in Sri Lanka, and they're going to reflect on their experience of claiming agency and creating change in response to work with Care International, where certain care offices were transformed into local NGOs. And in the article, they ask whether this transformation actually provided those new organisations and the Care Confederation itself with greater legitimacy or not. So Ashika, I'll go over to you to tell us more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you so much for having me. I also want to just really acknowledge here the co-authors of this article, Glenn Bond, Hazam, Fahmy, and Halima from Morocco, because I think it's collectively we really went through a process of understanding what this transition looked like within care between 2017 to 2021 to really understand when CARE committed to locally led processes, localization, and shifting the power, what did it really mean to us as practitioners? And as you said, Kate, very correctly, we do place great commitment and political will in that change, but then to really understand, is that really enough? And are we really ready to take on the real challenges and make changes happen? So between 2017 and 2021, we followed these three entities in Sri Lanka, in Egypt, and in Morocco to really assess the idea of shifting power. And we tried to do that in a very practical sense and try to identify what are some parameters that we should be monitoring with regards to that discourse. So we looked at power, for example, how do we really gain power, and how do global northern entity, which is CARE in this case, how do they understand that power shift? And how do we who sit in the global south understand that power shift as well? And how do we claim that power? Then we also talked about the influence that we may have in relation to the Confederation in particular. Once we become locally led entities, what level of influence do we really have? And then we also looked at accountability to those shifts. What does it mean to accountability, not only to ourselves, but also communities that we work with? How do they understand that accountability to locally led interventions, locally led decision making, locally led institutions? And we also looked at legitimacy. What does legitimacy look like for us, particularly when we come from or are institutions that have been CARE in the past, but now are not? So how do we then establish our legitimacy in the countries and contexts where we work? Because our claim to be a local organization also is tied up very much with that legitimacy. Because how do we really almost shake off that identity we had previously as a CARE country office, for example, in all our cases? And how do we then become more legitimate in those contexts? So we followed that process all those years. And what was really interesting was that CARE's commitment to this change was very real. And I think there was a political will to make that shift happen. And it also meant that CARE would kind of then, where they had only three locally southern member partners in that case, they were going to increase that number. So that meant a real shift for CARE. So I think those genuine political understanding, the genuine interest that CARE had to make this change happen was very real. So we were, propelled, or we were really invited to become decision makers of this confederation as equal partners, which is something that we did not have before. Now, with all that change happening, what we also found was the fact that, CARE is a large organization. It's a very old organization that's been very much led from the global north. And, I think you also spoke to this, Kate, about the values and as well as the norms that governed it. Does it then get reflected in this shift as well? Because there was always that driver, which is about funds, which is about control. Does that driver supersede the change for change, the desire for change? We always had issues around control, and particularly with relation to fundraising. So how does that shift? Because it really begs the question, even though we say this is what we want to do, this is the shift, what the shift will look like, and we do want the engagement of locally led entities. But when it comes to actual control and access to donors, access to resources, does that really shift? And then we were in a position where we had to, I feel, and this is again my opinion, had to constantly prove our credibility, that we had that burden of proof to kind of say, yes, we had the capacity, yes, we had the legitimacy, yes, we had the influence in our local context. So we seem to have that burden of proof to also say that we are legitimate partners of this confederation. So I think it is, having said that, as I said, it is very hard to shift those norms, those values that govern a large organization. But what we found in that process, and the fact that CARE actually invested in this localization process or locally led processes, also meant that there was political will. So there was always this tension between wanting to make that shift and wanting to make that change. And it also meant it impacted the legitimacy of international NGOs as well, because there was also pushback to say that international NGOs in countries like ours really did not have the legitimacy. So in many ways, this system required international NGOs to also change the way that they work, but also engage with local-led actors in a way that reflected a more equal partnership. So this, as you said, we take two steps forward, but it's also two steps back.
Give you 30 more seconds.
Thank you. So, I think it's just a reflection of our experience, but I also want to just say maybe the last thing here that, CARE's commitment to this change is very real, but it really does struggle. Everyone, all of us actors in the system really struggle to make this happen for real. And also one thing, Kate, that I feel I want to say, this idea of shifting power can mean a lot of things, because there's an assumption there that we never really had any power. And now those with power is now shifting the power to us. I think that the language in which we use, terms like locally led, locally driven, I think these language that we use also is quite colonial in many ways, including shifting power, that assumption that those of us really never really had power. So somehow someone had to give us the power. So it's also a reflection as to how Global South actors also understand the powers that they have in terms of navigating how we work. And ultimately, it is about how do we have impact and how do we really engage the communities that we work with. So let me stop there. And then I hope I finished in 30 seconds. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much. And that's such an important point you were making just at the end as well about this could be slightly patronizing terminology of shifting the power, as if power doesn't exist in the first place, but also that really interesting interplay between political will being there, but the complexities of practice and making that real and how that worked. I'm going to pass on to Vibhor next, who joins us from the University of Bath, where he will be sharing insights from a new form of community organisation from the urban slums of Hyderabad, which aim to shift the traditional sort of NGO social worker relationship with community members. So moving from being saviours and problem solvers to becoming facilitators, contributing to building collective and relational power within communities. So Vibhor, over to you.
Thanks, Kate. And thank you, Ashika, not thank you for setting the bar so high. It was such a wonderful start to this conversation. Similarly, shout out to my co-authors who I'm representing here, Joel Lazarus and Maria Franchi. And a lot of what I'm going to be reporting on and reflecting on is built in some brilliant theoretical and practice work that they have done for many, many years now that we then trialed. The work I'm talking about is geographically not very far from where Ashika and her colleagues did their work in the slums of urban South India. And as a little bit of background, my professional career started with setting up NGOs of my own, charities of my own. And like many of us with all the right ideas and all the right motivation, my aim was to also enter communities living in marginalized, precarious, underserved contexts and try and see what do they need? What intervention can we trial that will be the next silver bullet that will help them on their journeys out of this sort of poverty or marginalization. And one after the other, I worked in the education sector, I worked in community mobilizing, and everywhere the idea was the same. What can we trial? What solution can we bring in? And as I came into sort of more reflective spaces, but also more research spaces, and started to take a step back from the work that I was doing, I was suddenly aware of the history of the development sector, which, with all the love and respect in my heart, is often a graveyard to some truly horrible, ethically fraught, and colonial action, not just in India, but around the world. And perhaps the biggest problem that we have identified through our research, through our reflection, through our reflective practice, is this separation between those designing and doing the action and those who action is done on rather than with. I think this isn't a crowd that I need to give any more detail onto for that because we're all similarly minded and that's why we're here. But I suppose the way the industries have worked and the path dependency that that has created in how NGOs have to set themselves up, how they have to talk about their work, how they have to report on their work, necessarily has this inbuilt separation between those providing the service and those who the service is being provided to, whatever it may be. And fundamentally, we wanted to trial a form of working in these communities that's different. That's fundamentally relational, that's fundamentally participatory, that's fundamentally needs-based. And as we say in this paper, we're not reinventing the wheel. We're building on the shoulders of giants who've done such incredible work in the space of decolonial participatory praxis. But I suppose what we try to do is really center the relational element in that work. What does that mean? We were working with a partner NGO in slum communities in Hyderabad, which has an incredible history of fighting for civil rights, housing rights, community mobilization. But a lot of the way their work works, a lot of how my work worked previously, and lots of people's work in the NGO sector works, is you enter a community, you talk to these people who are living lives of marginalization and precarity, and you say, what's the problem? They say the problem is X. You say, right, how can we solve it? So to give you an example, in these communities, we say, these NGO workers would enter the community. The community would say, we really need an Anganwadi, which in India is an early childhood nutrition center. And they would say, right, how do we fix that? How do we write letters to the government? How do we petition to the bureaucrat? How do we try and fundraise for it? Find the solution immediately. Our system of what we were calling relational needs-based practice is to enter the community and no longer say, what's the problem? Here's a solution. But shift that role of the NGO worker to say, okay, let's facilitate the conversation about what do you truly need? And we built on the work of people like Manfred Max Neef and building on frameworks of needs to say, okay, the Anganwadi, the Early Childhood Nutrition Center, is a satisfier to a need. What is the need? Why do you need an Anganwadi? What is it going to do? And that's when the conversation started to shift away from let's find the solution as soon as possible to what are our collective needs as a people. And that conversation went to actually what we need is safety for our children. We're a community of garbage collectors and we leave at 4 a.m. and our children are playing on the streets. And therefore, the job of the social worker shifts from being the one who's the expert, quote unquote, providing the solution to divert the conversation to relational conversation around needs, to facilitating that conversation around needs. And the community then starts to reflect on what are our needs, what are the collective resources that we hold, what possible solutions exist, and how can we try and work towards resourcing them. This is not to say that any of the traditional work of practice is inherently bad, but it relies really heavily on the savioristic potential of the social worker. Whereas what we were trying to see is, can we build the relational power within the communities that make solutions more grounded in their needs, their resources, and their energy to sustain them? I'm aware of time, so I won't go too much into this, but I will say that the beauty of doing this as a pilot, as a researcher, is you get to see how this ideal type utopia you're trying to create interacts with the big bad real world. And we saw that dynamism over the 2 years that we tried to do this. On the one hand, we had the social workers feeling deep resistance because obviously for 30 years they've had a sort of practice which has been providing that solution. And it almost to them felt unethical to be in the community, have a solution in their mind, but not provide it. And we had to try and work with them to say, look, the problem isn't you providing the solution. Of course you can. But it's can you broaden the scope of what you do in that community? And similarly, how do they then report back how many problems they've solved, how many people they've worked with, how do they meet targets for fundraisers, how do they show scale? Because the problem with deepening relational work is it's often not as quote unquote efficient as we need to be for our theories of change, for our funding cycles, and all the cycles that we find ourselves stuck into. On the other hand, though, we see that there was a little bit of deepening within the organization. So on the one hand, the organization had to deal with the barriers of their funders, their reporting, their impact stories, which often we facilitated these deep conversations doesn't lend itself to. But on the other hand, there was that inherent shift. I am just wrapping up, Kate. This is the last 30 seconds. There was that internal shift. And if I can say, in our paper, we document the shifts within the social worker, between the social workers and the communities, and within the communities. But that deepening internal emotional shift within the social workers started to then percolate into different aspects of their work, not just our project, but all the different sort of verticals that they were working on. And to us, that was a little sliver of hope of shifting the practice, if we can say so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vibhor. Yeah, that was really interesting how to move beyond the separation and start with relational approach. But both you and Ashika talked about the influence, I guess, the legitimacy that Ashika mentioned, and how the change in the social worker could start spreading beyond the particular project. So great ideas around wider practice shifts. I'm now moving to Zunera, who joins us from the Netherlands, where she's the Vice Programme Director of the Global Challenges Programme and a researcher at the Rathbone Centre for Social Sciences. And she'll share work that was done with colleagues to develop and pilot a power awareness tool, which is designed to facilitate structured conversations throughout the partnership cycle. So over to you, Zunera.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone before me as well. Already, as said, the bar is set quite high. Quick shout out to my co-authors, including Willem Elbers, Laus Schilpen, and Heinz Kreins. So the actual tool, Power Awareness Tool, was developed by Willem and by Heinz a couple of years ago with the intention that we are talking a lot about shifting the power, but how is it exactly that we can measure this shift, and how can we make this talk about shifting the power more concrete? So the idea behind the paper that we have for the special issue was to actually evaluate the tool, which has been used by quite a lot of NGOs, both in the Netherlands and abroad. And by abroad, I mean both Global North and Global South. So what we did basically was that we did some surveys and focus groups in order to see how the tool was being used. Was it useful? And the main question that we were trying to answer in that sense was that what is the effectiveness of it? And it's very important to point out over here that the Power Awareness Tool specifically focuses on the decision-making side of power imbalances. So it doesn't only talk about power imbalances all over, but specifically focuses on decision making. And there is a decision making ladder that you can follow to see where do you stand in terms of your relationship with the partner, maybe in Global North or Global South. It was a very, very interesting exercise to do that, to speak to so many NGOs and organizations to see how the tool was being used. And I can talk about three main findings that we think were very important from our discussions. The first one, not surprising, there are power imbalances that exist. Quite a lot of power imbalances were related to decision making on agenda setting to begin with. So, imbalance comes right at the start of partnerships. It's not something that goes in, but your partnerships are starting quite imbalanced. And there are the second thing was with regards to reporting requirements. There are imbalances in what should be reported, how should be reported, who makes the decision on what is reporting, and what is more relevant in terms of reporting. There were a lot of discussions related to that as well. So yeah, The first main point was that there were power imbalances that exist. The second very interesting point was that NGOs, specifically in the global north, thought that they themselves were not part of the problem. So the general idea was that we know there is need for shifting the power. There are power imbalances in this sector, but we are good guys and we don't are not part of that problem. And the interesting thing was when we spoke to their partners in Global South, they said, yeah, we have very severe power power imbalances or decision making imbalances that existed. So that meant that NGOs in global north specifically underestimated the power imbalances within their own partnerships, while acknowledging the bigger structural problem of power imbalances that exist. And then the third important point was that the tool itself was quite effective in starting the conversation, but it was very difficult to come to action points, clear, concrete points that, the organizations are going to follow, the partners are going to follow in order to reduce these power imbalances. And here we saw that this point was specifically raised by Global South organizations because they really liked the start of the conversation, but they said, yeah, it took a long time. We did a whole day of exercise and everything, but concrete actions were never formulated. And they were always like, okay, there will be a follow-up, but that did not lead to actual real follow-ups and real changes. So what we can conclude from our paper and our discussion was that there is quite a lot of talk. People understand there is a problem. People want to solve the problem, but there is lack of internal reflection within organizations. And this internal reflection should be the starting point. So it shouldn't be about the sector, it should be about you, your partnerships, and how things are going internally, and use that as a base to actually start the discussion on shift the power. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Kate. Over to you.
Thank you. And you finished before my timer went off, so I'm now all confused. Well done. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for really emphasizing the need to start with ourselves or our individual organizations. It reminded me when you were speaking, there's a thing in the UK where every driver thinks that they're a better than average driver. And I feel like it's the same thing. Every organization feels like they're better than average. And maybe that's what we need to reflect on. I'm now going to pass over to Rachel Smith, who's the Vice President of Global Community Programmes and Partnership at Global Giving UK, and she'll share her experience of reimagining the role of an intermediary grant maker, moving from a transactional relationship to viewing their role as ecosystem builders, advocates, amplifiers, co-conspirators and learners. So over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Kate, and hello, everybody. I'm Rachel. And so I come from an organisation called Global Giving. We're a global funding intermediary with a mission to drive more funding to local initiatives that are deeply informed by community needs and built on trust-based principles. So we support nonprofits to raise funding and receive donations, as well as manage grant programs. And it's within that last piece that the case study that we presented through the journal came through. So the case study we presented was around an experimental grant making initiative that was funded by USAID, RIP, rest in peace, and through its local works funding mechanism. So for those of you that don't know that funding mechanism, it wasn't a funding mechanism that it really wanted to focus on resourcing initiatives that could examine and facilitate and hopefully advance locally led development. In brief, this initiative gave us an opportunity to pilot a new and different way, and especially new and different for USAID funding or ODA funding, to fund and support community actions in the Philippines. So Global Giving partnered really closely with a national network or another national and an intermediary, Center for Disaster Preparedness Foundation Philippines. So I am really pleased to be here to share some of our collective learning, but I'm doing that on behalf of Lorraine, Mike, Seema, Kathy, Mariella, and others that were really involved in this program and this work. So the power shifting question behind the case study that we presented in the paper was, what if intermediaries stopped acting primarily as gatekeepers of funding and started to act as ecosystem builders? So we went in with the intention that this was not just about a funding initiative designed to move money, but that we had a real opportunity here to intentionally think about how we shift power in reality and in practice. So I want to share 3 key shifts that we experienced over the next few minutes. First is that transformation begins with shared purpose and not just funding. So I'm really glad that I come straight after the power awareness tool discussion. So we actually really intentionally started this initiative by making some deliberate choices together as a collection of partners. So instead of assuming traditional or fixed roles, donor, intermediary, or implementer, we paused and we asked ourselves together, what if we remove those labels? And what if we saw ourselves instead as connectors, as negotiators, co-conspirators, learners? We were playing practical roles, but we were also really starting with a shift in mindset that we were there together to collectively, critically think about everything that we were doing, from the program design to partnership, monitoring, reporting. The other key thing was that we started first to align around values. So we had outcomes, we had a whole load of stuff that we'd produced in order to get funding from USAID, but we decided to start our partnership work in really grounding ourselves in values. And so we grounded particularly in Filipino values, since we were working exclusively in the Philippines, like Bayanihan, which speaks to collective solidarity, mutual support. So whilst we were a group of practitioners coming from many different realities, some of us not in the Philippines, others in, we decided that we wanted to focus in on those values in primacy. And we also openly acknowledged some of what others have shared just now about some of the uncomfortable truths of our existing global aid system. There were structural inequalities. We knew that we were all coming with different experiences, but we wanted to start by being really explicit about that. And what it did is it gave us permission to experiment, to question existing dynamics or dynamics we were used to. And it also helped shift our mindset from how do we manage this as a program or as a grant to how do we share power ethically and durably by spending time in this initiative. But shared purpose was just the beginning. The second shift was really about intentionally redefining roles and sharing what risk looked like in practice, so in really practical terms. CDP, so the Philippines National Intermediary, they led the design and implementation of the Abot Kamay Community Solidarity Fund. I'll just put in the chat, or I can't put in the chat, I'll put in the chat after the link to that fund. Global Giving was the primary recipient of funds from USAID, but we took a decision to really step back from deciding who would receive the grants, how the decisions for those grants would be made. And I will admit, like, letting go of some of that decision-making power, particularly because we were the ones Global Giving was the ones directly on the hook with USAID from a kind of compliance and delivery perspective, it felt risky at first. And we really had to kind of like talk to ourselves about what it means to control and manage risk, and that having control doesn't necessarily mean reducing risk. And so what we actually found by kind of giving ourselves permission a little bit was that CDP's relationships, their context and the trust that they were able to build, that in and of itself was reducing risk, and it was creating more grounded and more legitimate programming and relationship building. We actually explicitly reframed compliance within the experience of the program. So we changed it from being, very top down and very compliance driven to being more relational. CDP designed the processes called getting to know our partners, as opposed to it being a, checkbox or going through documentation. And sort of conversely, we also looked at sort of compliance as more of a learning approach, so more of a learning experience. One of the things we did experience, though, and this speaks a little bit to the fact that we are working in a way or within a context within which we have many decades of experience, and organizations that are recipients of funds have experience of expecting for donor reporting to look a particular way or to be in a particular way. And even with our invitation to be more learning in orientation, there was a real struggle. So we had to struggle to kind of understand what we were saying You don't have to count, you don't have to, but you can share learning. And so we had to really deliberately create spaces to enable the kind of learning and sharing that we were hoping for. And I guess that's where we saw our third shift, which was around this idea of intermediaries being ecosystem builders rather than kind of facilitators of transactions. So much more about solidarity than in about, just making things happen and playing our individual roles. So over the 3 years, the initiative granted just under 400,000 US dollars to 32 community-led efforts. And one of the real successes from that was that the communities were able to leverage that funding and mobilize more than 500,000 US dollars worth of assets beyond that. That was one of our key success points, was to look at how we could support communities to leverage resources that they may get externally. But really what mattered more was the changes that we saw relationally and also in our organizational strategies. So I've described this, and this experience was really sort of an experimental opportunity that we had. But what we've been able to do in CDP is they learned so much. They've restructured their organization, and they've really elevated this model of partnership as really part of their going forward approach. And similarly, Global Giving, as a more global intermediary, we manage lots of different funds. We've really lent into what we've learned in this kind of national hub kind of model, and use that a lot within the design of the funds that we manage.
I'm going to get you to stop there, Rachel. Sorry.
Yeah, sure, no worries. No, yeah, that's fine. So I think that's it anyway, almost to the conclusion. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And yeah, a great example of how to reimagine compliance from reporting to learning, and how having strong trust actually reduces risk. I think there are some really practical ideas there. I'm now going to pass over to Jess Crombie, who's a researcher and a consultant, and she'll share reflections on the dynamics of communication and storytelling within humanitarian contexts. The article itself draws on perspectives from two groups, from the Black diaspora communities in the UK and the people that we would call the subjects of humanitarian narratives in Africa and South Asia. So I'm sure Jess will tell us more about this. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm representing myself today, but also my co-author, Dr. Edward Adamolu from King's College, and who we are both passionate advocates for the bringing together of academic research and practical application. And so I'll try and do his work justice today. But this article really comes out of many years of working inside NGOs. So I spent 20 years in the humanitarian sector, and increasingly feeling that the stories we tell about people are shaping power in ways that we don't still fully acknowledge, as has been proved by some of my the previous speakers. We know that humanitarian narratives don't just raise money, but they also mold how whole groups see ourselves. So we wanted to ask in this article, what if we change representation, what does that actually mean, and how could it be done? And I've spent a lot of my time as a researcher over the last 7 years really thinking about who's involved in the production of the narratives that shape power relations. And I'm interested in the three groups that are involved in this: the makers, the humanitarian communications and agencies, the fundraising teams, the audiences, the donors, the policymakers, the wider public, and then the people who are often featured in the stories, but commonly do not have as much power in the decision-making processes, sometimes known as beneficiaries or subjects, terms I do not like. I'm going to prefer the term contributor today. And for most of my career, I was firmly in the maker role, and like many people in that role, working to pre-written briefs that had already decided whose stories were valuable and what they needed to say. And what I realized through many years of doing this and working all over the world was that the people I was working with didn't want to fit into those roles. They questioned the approach, they subverted the narrative, or they just simply refused to become a part of it. And so a lot of the work that I have been doing is now returning to those people and saying, and asking them about the motivations, about the process, and about the final portrayal. And rather profoundly, one young woman once told me, I want to take the photos, not be an object, which I take as a sort of guiding North Star in this work. But ultimately, there were some very uneven power balances that needed addressing. And so what Edward and I talked about a lot was about kind of concrete shifting of power around who gets to make editorial decisions about narrative. And I guess what we felt a real power shift would involve is people who, so it's all three parts of that triangle being involved in decision making from the start of story production through editing right up to final approval and where a story is used. And for anyone involved in story production in the humanitarian sector, that is an uncomfortable proposition, both logistically, but also in terms of it requires makers to relinquish not only control, but also the assumption that they know best about what the right message for audiences looks like. Edward and I also talked a lot about, in this article, about turning the lens onto ourselves. We talked about the well-meaning liberal trap, the risk that you attempt to improve ethics and you end up reproducing the same power dynamics. And one of the things I reflected on was some work I did with UNHCR when I wrote their ethical communications guidelines. And in the draft, I removed the word dignity because it's so loaded, and I associate it with NGOs imposing their own idea of dignity onto people they worked with. But at my request, a group of people who were experiencing being refugees around the world were involved in the reviewing of those guidelines, and they challenged that, saying that actually multiple losses of dignity were central to their experience and actually needed naming. So inadvertently, by trying to prevent UNHCR making decisions on their behalf, I had done exactly that. And it's this kind of recognition and contradiction that we really have to recognize if we're serious about changing practice. You can do good. You can do bad while doing good, even if inadvertently. Edward's research talks a lot about missing what he calls crucial audiences, and in his work that has been African diaspora communities in the UK, of which he is a part, who are rarely the target of these campaigns but are very deeply affected by them. And what Edward's really brilliant work has shown is how stereotyped imagery reproduces psychosocial harm, but also changes the behavior of people taking actions with and on behalf of NGOs. And so it can actually push people away. And there's both this kind of ethical and strategic argument. If we ignore diaspora audiences, we damage trust and credibility and support amongst communities who really should be central partners to what we're trying to do. And so lastly, we talked about pragmatism. So Edward and I both work in communities of academics and practitioners who are arguing for the complete dismantling of INGOs altogether, and why I'm absolutely not against that. My work is much more pragmatically looking at what can we do inside the flawed structures whilst being really honest about their limits. And one proposal is to recognise that INGOs are, whether they admit it or not, educators. So every appeal, every piece of communications teaches audiences something about the people and the places depicted. And what we advocate for is a move from being audience-led, where we are repeating what people say they want to hear and currently respond to being audience-leading, where we are asking people to reflect on something new. And one of the pieces of work that we share in the research is some tests that I've been carrying out with a number of NGOs, where we've been trialing exactly that model in a process called contributor-centered storytelling. I'll pop a couple of links in the chat around that afterwards. So really, just to conclude, we argue that we need to think about both the personal, makers recognizing their power and the real impacts of their decisions, the practical, systematically listening to and testing materials, not just with donors, but also with diaspora groups and people who are more often the subjects of stories. And then finally, the cultural, accepting that expertise is not that comes from these big organizations is not the only useful knowledge in the room, and what we need to think more about is genuine decision-making power, as all my colleagues on this talk have brilliantly argued for as well. Thanks so much.
And that was exactly 6 minutes to my timer went off. I'd really, thank you for that. And I'd also encourage people to read the article because it's written really nicely. It's a sort of dialogue between Jess and Edward, and it just makes it very easy to read and sort of illustrates the positionality and their contribution, I guess, to this debate and this story. I really liked this reflection on being a well-meaning liberal person, but also moving from being audience-led to audience-leading and thinking about what that looks like in practice. I'm going to pass over to Mohamed now, who's going to share how they use participatory action research in Egypt to enable equitable, responsive, and reflective malpractice, and I think monitoring, evaluation, and learning practice. And I think what was really interesting in this article was showing how monitoring, evaluation, and learning can play a strong role in power shifts, but only if we shift the practice. So over to you, Mohamed.
Thanks, Kate, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to join you to share insights on the praxis note I have co-authored with my colleague, Mary Ramses, under title Use of Participatory Action Research to Develop Participatory Monitoring and Evaluation Learning Practices. So it was basically about our 4-year journey between 2019 and 2022 of working with a project called Arts for All in south of Egypt, that was implemented by a local NGO called Ana Masri and funded by a Swiss foundation called DROSIS. It demonstrates how participatory action research can transform monitoring evaluation practices when applied intentionally. It emerged from the realization of the M&E systems are still dominated by top-down donor frameworks. Tools, indicators, and evaluation criteria are often designed externally by experts or consultants, leaving local implementation teams and communities with limited influence over what's measured and how learning is used. On the other side, participatory action research challenged this model of positioning local implementation teams and communities as a primary producers of knowledge. So participatory action research basically offers a practical way to rethink how we approach monitoring, evaluation, learning, not as a technical reporting requirement, but as a process of collective reflection, decision-making, and improvement. And instead of relying on external evaluators, the project team became engaged in iterative cycle of planning, action, and observation and reflection together with the project team and participants. So this collaborative process shifted monitoring and evaluation from being a compliance exercise to becoming a tool for learning, adaptation, and empowerment. The approach also strengthened the trust between implementation organization and donor, and decision-making became more evidence-based and locally grounded. And I will explain more how we managed to implement that in action. So the praxis note highlights 9 steps that we followed throughout these 4 years. It started with securing leadership buy-in. We started with introduction of participatory action research to the organizational leadership and ensuring their commitment to this lengthy process, and also their commitment to share the decision-making throughout this process. Second, we worked on forming a co-inquiry group in which project staff became co-researcher who collaboratively explore the challenges and learning questions together as long as we go this in process. Third, we introduced reflection practices techniques and methods as reflective writing, storytelling, and visual tools that helps the project team to capture experiential knowledge and their experiences in a way that can be reflective. Fourth, we worked on deepening understanding of the project and communities. So the project team, we worked with them to revisit the theory of a change of this project, and we conducted a kind of participatory baseline assessment to help them as a part of this action research to understand the needs of the community they are working in. Fifth, we worked on redesigning the project based on the learning we got from this baseline assessment and needs assessment we did, and we got additional evidence from the reflection and data we collected, and accordingly we adjusted the implementation strategy of the project. Six, we developed monitoring and evaluation tools collaboratively with the team that is context specific and appropriate for their context, but also providing or moving away from imposed templates or already templates. So they had to develop it in a way that build on their own experience, but also respond to the emerging needs they have from their field work. Seventh, as we implemented these monitoring and evaluation tools, we facilitated cycles of reflection during implementation, and we organized regular reflection workshop to enable a kind of ongoing adaptation and learning as we go. Towards the end of the project, we worked with the project team on participatory assessment of the outcome. So we worked together with the project implementation team to design evaluation tools and collect data that help them to combine quantitative information with the lived experience of the participant coming through different qualitative tools. And ninth, and the last step, we facilitated also a whole reflection process on the entire journey of the 4 years, and we supported the project team to document their journey in a kind of a reflective booklet as a way to document the process. And this reflective book was also a source of writing this article, because we referred to all the reflections they have wrote by themselves. So these steps demonstrate how BAR is not a single, participatory action research is not a single activity, but a continuous cycle embedded throughout the project cycle. And one of the most important insights from applying participatory action research was how power shifted, not only with the project team, but also across the implementing organization, and also in the relation of the implementing organization with the donor agency. So we reflected on a 3 level of power shifts. The first level was at the project level. We observed how participatory action research process increased the ownership among the team. Staff were no longer only implementing predefined activities, they became co-researchers who generated knowledge, analyzed data, and made decisions based on evidence from their own practice. This strengthened their accountability, not just upward towards the donors, but also towards the communities they are working with. They became more intentional in seeking participant feedback and adapting activities accordingly. Second, within the NGO itself, participatory action research disturbed traditional hierarchies. As we face in many organizations, decision-making is usually centered at the senior management level, but through the participatory action research workshops, we observed how new communicative spaces emerged between the management and the project team, and staff became more able to question assumptions, to discuss challenges openly, and contribute to strategic decisions within the NGO, which wasn't the case before that. This created a more of transparency and trust internally, and also it helped the organization to become more responsive and adaptive to community realities. In practice, participatory action research contributed to moving the organization closer to becoming a learning organization. Third, and this is perhaps the most interesting one, participatory action research influences the relationship with the donor agency. Traditionally, donors hold significant powers through funding control and reporting requirements. However, as the project team developed a deeper knowledge about the participant and communities out of participatory action research process, they became more able to engage with the donor more confidently. We observed how the decision became more collaborative between the project team and the donor representative rather than a directive one. And instead of monitoring compliance, the donor became a partner in reflection and improvement. And this shift strengthened the trust between both sides and encouraged the donor to replicate this approach with other partners they work with. Overall, what we see in the participatory action research is not simply a redistribution of power in one direction. Rather, it creates a more balanced reciprocal relation between the project team and communities, between implementing staff and senior management, and between local organizations and donors. And for us, the most significant takeaway was when the local knowledge is recognized and used and confidence grows and relationship improve and learning becomes shared rather than controlled. So the key lesson is that applying participatory action research doesn't necessarily require additional resources, but it requires commitment, to reflection and dialogue, willingness to share decision-making power, recognition of local knowledge as a valid evidence, and iterative learning throughout implementation. When all these elements are present, monitoring and evaluation becomes more meaningful, more responsive, and more empowering for everyone involved. Ultimately, participatory action research transforms monitoring and evaluation from a system of control into a process of a collective learning, enabling organizations to become more relevant to their communities and the communities they serve, and more confidence in their knowledge. And I hope you enjoy reading our praxis note. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's such a great pleasure to be part of the dialogue today. The article we are going to discuss today come off a long-term collaborative journey at Viêm Peacemakers here in Cambodia, involving academic partners, practitioners, and community researchers, including blind women and indigenous women and ethnic minority women and LGBTQI+ individuals. So I'm very honored today to represent our co-author and partners, namely Raymond, Brioni, Lei, Nika, Srenia, and Tida, in sharing with you all our experience. So our research used a Cambodian homegrown participatory action research methodology called facilitative listening design, or in short FLD. So in this FLD process, community members were not only invited to simply share their stories and then step aside. Rather, they engaged throughout the process in co-designing the research objective, questions, tools, and making it accessible to diverse community researchers conducting listening fieldwork within their own communities, reflecting collectively on what they were hearing and ultimately contributing as co-author. And doing so, they directly shape what knowledge was produced, how it was interpreted and presented, which in practice mean that their subjective viewpoint are not and their lived experience is prioritized over something that might be more objective and detached from how they see their own worlds. And also they were told through the voices of those who live the topic of study and ground their analysis through knowing and the insiderness of their positionalities. Their words, reflections, and interpretation are not treated as illustrated quote only, but rather as analysis in their own right. So this is done through their own ongoing analysis. Their reflection presented are rooted through their inquiries, both as the researcher who investigate and as the research whose issues are at the center of the studies. And the process is, of course, not that easy or linear, as our previous speaker had mentioned. It requires us to approach it differently to challenge the conventional norms. Methodology, for example, need to be adapted to ensure accessibility, inclusion, and agency. For the academic partners, their work required them to step into a different role, not as an expert delivering conclusion, but rather as collaborator engaged in dialogue with the insider researchers. And for the practitioners, it also required them to prioritize process, ethic, accessibility, and relationship with over speeds and need outputs. And it also required the community researcher themselves to own their space as a knowledge holder in speaking and challenging dominant narrative. This is where shifting power actually become tangible in a research context. In our article, you will learn about Nika, a blind massage therapist who became a researcher. She adapted the method to work with other blind women to collect data and record their insight on their phone and doing analysis as they went along. You will also hear from Srenia, an indigenous women from a Cambodian Bunong community who use song from her ancient traditions, reminding us that that song are just like knowledge production as they form, evolve, and are sung from one generation to the next, carrying what we know into the future. You also learn about Lei, a young Cambodian Cham Muslim minority women who accompanies the finding from her research through her own story and her in-depth understanding of the issues. And finally, you will have a chance to get to know Tida, a transgender Cambodian man who enthusiastically share what happened when the research become the researcher themselves. So this experience shows us three main things. One is that shifting power in research is not a slogan or a single intervention. It is an ongoing practice. It means changing who get to frame the question and who get to make sense of the answer. It's also about how we listen, how we write, how we attribute knowledge, and how willing we are to be changed by the research process of ourselves. Power shift when people move from being the respondent to being the researcher and authors. Secondly, retelling research in the voices of the community who experience the issues of study, challenge all hierarchies. So when people speak for themselves, it disrupts the idea that only academic or outsider can produce valid knowledge. It reminds us that lived experience is expertise itself. It is not secondary and it's not an add-on. And thirdly, real change happens in everyday relationship. Shifting power doesn't only require new funding model or new methodology, although those really matter. It's also about listening, humility more than directing, and this happens in everyday research relationship. Like who is trusted to ask questions, who is seen as capable of analysis, who has the authority to speak publicly, and who get credit for knowledge. So we know this work can be a reminder and perhaps a challenge to all of us working in this space that it was if we are serious about shifting power, then community cannot remain in the margin of the knowledge production. The lived experience and voices in the retelling the research finding is not supplementary. It is critical. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.